I lost my dad 2 years ago while we were out camping. I'll never forget anything about that day. It was an early morning in mid-October, and as usual, Dad was ready for the annual camping trip. Son, get up, get dressed, let's get to move on, Dad said. My eyelids peeled open slowly as my body booted itself on. I'm up, Pops, just gotta get my gear together, I said. Be down in 15, I lied. I got dressed, grabbed my bag, and headed downstairs. Dad was outside checking the engine on the truck, and Mom was watching news in the kitchen. Dad said send you out when you came downstairs, Mom said. I ran over to my mother, gave her a kiss on the cheek. Love you, Mama, I'll see you in a couple days, I said. She said it back, hugged me, and shooed me off. Dad was getting the last bit of equipment packed, so I decided to put my stuff in the truck and wait for him to finish. Son, come help me with this, Dad said. I made my way over. What's wrong, Pops? You getting too old for this? I laughed. I'll never be too old to whoop your ass, he laughed. Just then, my father's demeanor changed. Tony, if anything ever happens, son, never go camping again, he said cryptically. What's that supposed to mean, Dad? I said, but he ignored me and kept going. I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just joking with me. I helped him with the rest of the equipment. We loaded it all up and got into the truck. My dad was a very kind man, give you the shirt off his back kind of guy. He was funny, caring, and made you feel like you could conquer the world. He was also quiet and standoffish at times, which I figured was his military service bleeding out. He never really talked about it, but Mom would always say, Dad came home after the war ended, but his mind is still at war. Some nights he would wake up screaming, and I'd hear Mom promising it was all okay, and he'd be okay. But for the most part, he was an amazing man who treated his family like royalty. So, kiddo, are you ready for this year's camping trip? Dad asked. Of course I am, Pops, I said, lying straight through my teeth. But I couldn't let him know that because it would crush him. I'm 16 now and I have a girlfriend. This is getting to be kid stuff to me. But I love my dad and I know what this means to him. You sure you're not upset you have to leave your little girlie back home? He joked. I brushed off the comment and sighed. He laughed and continued to drive out to the campsite. It took us about 4 hours to get out there. It's out in the middle of nowhere, California, nothing but high trees and higher mountains. Our campsite was situated right on the side of a cliff. I began to pull the camping stuff out of the truck when I noticed my dad pacing and muttering under his breath. He made his way around the area, checking things out. He seemed a little agitated, but I brushed it off and kept pulling things out. An hour or so later and camp was set up. It was about 3 p.m. at this point and we were starting to get hungry. Let's get down to that river and get us some dinner, Dad said. I agreed and we made our way down the hill to the river. When we got down to the water, I noticed the cliff our campsite sat on overlooked it. The river was quite violent, churning rapids loud as plane engines. The roar could be felt in your chest. My father made his way down to the river to a split off that ran into a creek. He explained the slower water was perfect for catching fish, and then he froze. Abruptly, his voice stopped. I looked over and noticed Dad was staring into the woods and whispering something to himself. I couldn't make out. His eyes so glazed over, I'm surprised tears didn't begin to fall. I could hear him saying what sounded like the last time, but I wasn't sure. I made my way closer to Dad. Dad, are you okay? I said, but he didn't move an inch. I looked out into the woods, but seen nothing. I reached out to grab his shirt. Dad, I fearfully asked, fingers outreached, trembling towards him. All of a sudden, he snaps out of it, twisting his head towards me, smiling. The slower water is perfect for catching fish, son, he said, his head twisting slowly back towards the river. I was quick to notice that this episode looked a lot like symptoms of my father's PTSD, but he immediately snapped out of it. I was creeped out to say the least. The way he turned his head back towards the water scared me a little. I've never been afraid of my father, but that scared me. Son, hand me my fishing pole. Let's see if we can get us some grub, he said. I handed him the pole and we began to fish. We caught what seemed like 100 fish. It basically turned into sport, seeing who could catch the most. The entire time we were fishing and laughing, the episode played in my head on repeat. I tried my best to just forget it and enjoy the day with my dad. We went back to the campsite after fishing for a couple hours. We scaled the fish, gutted them, and skewered them on some branches and began to cook them. Dad grabbed a beer out of his cooler, sat down with a piece of wood, and began to whittle. I stood at the cliff and looked at the river, grabbed a rock and chucked it down into the water. I'd say we were about 75 feet up, but I wasn't sure. I turned and looked at Dad with wanting to question him about what happened today, but I couldn't. Maybe I was afraid to trigger his PTSD. I'm not sure what it was, but I couldn't. Dinner finished and we sat down to eat. Besides the creepiness of the day, I'd say it went pretty well. Dad cleaned up the dishes and I started gathering more wood for the coming day. By this time, it was about 8 p.m. and we were winding down. "How was your dinner, son?" he asked. "It was awesome, Dad. Thanks for cooking," I said. He shot me a thumbs up and started whittling the wood again. "Hey, Dad, what happened to you on the river today?" I worriedly asked. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You froze up, Dad, and repeated something you just told me," I said. "Froze up? What are you talking about?" he said, agitated. "It was nothing, Dad. You probably just didn't hear me," I said. "I haven't been sleeping very well, that's all. Don't worry about it, okay, son?" he said, calming down. He gestured over to his sleeping bag. "I'm gonna hit the hay, son. I'll wake you up in the morning so we can go hunt," he said. "All right, good night. Love you, Dad," I said. He disappeared into his tent, and I did the same. I fell asleep quite fast from the activities of the day. All of a sudden, I'm woken to a scream. Not just any scream, but it sounded like the scream of somebody being tortured. As soon as I sat up in my tent, it went quiet. No bugs, no fire crackling, no river, nothing. I unzipped my tent slowly and stuck my head outside. It was pitch black outside except for the glow of the moon on objects. I climbed out of my tent and made my way to Dad's tent. I unzipped it and stuck my head in. "Dad, are you okay?" I said. All I could hear was my father mumbling in his sleep. My father was having a conversation with himself. "You can't take them. They're my family," he whispered. All of a sudden, a voice came out of my father that couldn't have been his own. A deep, guttural, almost demon voice. "I will take you, then I will take them," it growled. I stumbled backwards out of the tent and fell to the ground. "Tony, are you okay?" Dad asked, peeking out of the tent. "Yeah, sorry, Dad, I was just checking on you," I said. "Are you okay, Dad?" I asked. He shook his head yes and told me to get back to bed. The rest of the night was calm. I laid in bed for an hour or so, playing what I had just heard over and over again in my head. I'm not sure what to chalk it up to, but I assumed it was PTSD. The following day, it was pretty normal. We hiked around some, fished some more, and gathered wood for the night. He didn't say much all day and seemed irritated. All in all, another good day. I dared not ask Dad about what I heard him say in his sleep. I'm not even sure he would have told me. "All right, son, I'm out," Dad said. "Love you, Pops. See you in the morning." When I got into my tent, I could feel the anxiety creeping up my back. The events of last night burning into my memory. I forced myself to stop thinking about it, and I began to tell myself to calm down and man up. That's when I heard it. What I can only describe as bones and meat churning. I stood up and looked around in the darkness. A silhouette of my dad standing completely still on the cliff's edge, whispering and looking down at the river, stood before me. I gasped in horror and began to sprint towards my dad. I got about 10 feet behind him and froze. I could finally hear what he was saying. "You can have me, but not them. This is the last time you hurt me," he said, whispering. "Dad, are you up?" Before I could even finish the thought, my dad looked back at me and said, "Never go camping again, son." And he leapt off the cliff. "No!" I screamed. The shock I felt almost made me pass out. I stood there emotionless, not understanding what just happened. Feelings slowly coming back to me, I began to sob. I ran to the cliff's edge, but there was nothing I could have done. Staring into the darkness, listening to the roar of the river below, reality began to set in. I need to get help right now. I grabbed the keys and hopped into the truck and drove all the way home to get help. I drove home in shock. I could swear I kept seeing my dad in the back of the truck. The entire 4-hour drive was a blur. I got home and rushed to my mother and explained to her what happened. That night I got there was the night before the annual trip. I got in, greeted my mother, and had dinner. That night I woke up to a cold chill running up my back, almost a familiar sense. I opened my eyes and stared around the dark room. It was so quiet in the room it frightened me. A whisper broke through the darkness. "Son, get up," it whispered. I sat up on the bed and rubbed my eyes. That's when I noticed it. A person's face looking at me from the bottom of the window, looking in from the backyard. More specifically, my father's face. His skin was paper white, his hair was matted. His eyes were black and evil. He began to speak in a quiet, deep tone. "Son, are you ready to go camping?" he said, raising a hand and tapping on the window with his long, sharp fingernails. I stared in absolute horror, froze by what I was looking at. I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. I stood up and backed away from the window. I turned the light on and he's gone. I opened my door and go to my mother's room. "Mom, are you awake?" I asked. "Yes, I'm awake, son. What's wrong?" she asked. "Mom, we need to leave right now. Something is outside and it..." Just then my mom cuts me off. "He can't get you, son, if you don't agree to go camping," she said as she rolled back over and went back to sleep. Mom, what the hell is that supposed to mean? I yelled, but she ignored me. This is crazy, I thought to myself. Did I really just see my dead dad staring at me through the window? I decided to step outside and see for myself. I'm not going to be able to sleep again if I don't figure this out. I walked around the house to where my window was and nothing was there. Just the woods behind our house and nothing more. Won't you go camping with me? A voice called from the woods. Won't you please? Just then, a figure on all fours scuttles out of the woods towards me and begins to scream horrible screams. I fall backwards onto my ass and close my eyes, waiting for the inevitable end. The screams get louder and louder until they're almost right on top of me. I'm not going camping with you, I screamed at the top of my lungs, my hands covering my eyes. Silence. I pry my hands away from my face and look up, expecting to be met with some horror. Nothing was there. No sign that anything had ever been there. At my feet was a small wooden cross with the words Father and Son carved into it. The cross my father whittled. I picked it up and keep it with me to this day. I'm not sure if I'm going crazy or not, but I know this for sure. I'm never camping again.